How has your day been so far? Hello, we're AETA Stories, and today we're sharing a brand new original story with you.
Charlotte Whitaker's life in Des Moines moved in quiet, repeatable loops. She rose before dawn, woke her daughter gently, packed a small lunch, and walked the 2 blocks to the bus stop with a mop handle tucked under her arm like a habit she could not set down. By 6:30, she was at the gas station on the east side, cleaning restrooms, wiping counters, emptying trash. The work was steady, unglamorous, and honest. It paid enough to keep the lights on if nothing unexpected happened, which, lately, felt like a fragile promise. Her routine left little room for error. When her shift ended, she hurried home to be with Anna, whose health required watchfulness and patience. There were weeks when Charlotte barely noticed the passing days. She measured time by pay periods, by grocery lists, by the small margin she tried to preserve between bills and whatever might go wrong next. It was not a miserable life, but it was narrow, and it asked more of her than she could easily give. William Whitaker was not part of that narrow world. As the owner of the gas station chain, he was a distant presence, polite, controlled, and observant when he did appear. He greeted employees by name, asked after families without prying, and never raised his voice. Charlotte had seen him only a handful of times in 3 years. Each time, he seemed careful to keep his authority from pressing too close. So when he knocked on her door one evening, Charlotte nearly missed it. She opened the door with a cleaning rag still in her hand, surprised to find him standing on her small porch, coat buttoned, posture formal. He apologized for arriving unannounced and asked if he might come in. The request alone unsettled her. William Whitaker did not visit employees' homes. Inside, he declined coffee and stood for a moment as if arranging his thoughts. He spoke slowly, choosing words with care, explaining that he needed to discuss something private, something unusual. He emphasized that he was not asking for an answer that night. The proposal, when it came, did not arrive all at once. He described a situation that required discretion. He mentioned a legal arrangement, a temporary commitment. He said it would involve marriage, but not in the way she was imagining. He assured her there would be respect, security, and time limits. He did not explain everything, not yet. Charlotte listened, her confusion deepening with each careful sentence. The idea felt unreal, inappropriate, almost offensive, and yet he spoke without coercion, without haste. He acknowledged how it must sound. He asked only that she consider it, weigh it, and keep the conversation private. When he stood to leave, he gave her a week, not an ultimatum. Time. Charlotte closed the door behind him and stood in the quiet of her living room, trying to steady her breathing. The evening had not changed her circumstances yet, but something had shifted. A door she had not known existed had opened, and she did not know whether stepping through it would save her or cost her more than she could afford. Charlotte's days had never belonged entirely to her. Even before the proposal, before William Whitaker stood in her living room and unsettled the balance of her life, everything revolved around managing time between work and her daughter's fragile health. Mornings were planned with precision. Afternoons were cautious. Nights were never fully restful. Anna's condition did not follow a schedule, and Charlotte learned early that preparation was the only defense she had. Anna's episodes began when she was still an infant. At first, doctors called them growing pains, then anxiety, then immature lungs. Over time, the explanations blurred together. The symptoms did not. Her breathing would suddenly grow shallow, her small hands trembling as panic overtook her body. Her eyes would widen, searching for air that seemed to vanish without warning. Charlotte learned how to hold her, how to speak calmly, how to count the seconds until the episode passed. But no amount of practice made the fear easier to bear. Local clinics did what they could. Tests were ordered, then repeated. Results came back inconclusive. One physician suggested Anna might outgrow it. Another recommended monitoring and patience. Advanced imaging and neurological testing were mentioned only in passing, followed by careful pauses and conversations about insurance coverage, deductibles, and costs that Charlotte knew she could not meet. Each appointment ended the same way, with reassurance and uncertainty, and a bill that arrived weeks later. Charlotte did not complain. She worked extra shifts when she could and accepted the limits placed in front of her. It was during that period that William Whitaker had quietly approved a bonus for her. No explanation was given. The amount was modest by corporate standards, but enormous to her. It covered a utility bill and a prescription refill. When she thanked him later, he only nodded and told her to take care of her family. The call came late one afternoon while Charlotte was finishing her shift. A neighbor's voice, tight with urgency, told her Anna was struggling again. Charlotte barely remembered locking the supply closet before running. The ambulance arrived almost as quickly as she did. The EMTs moved efficiently, practiced and calm. Oxygen, reassurance, monitoring. The episode subsided the way it always did, slowly, reluctantly. At the hospital, they repeated familiar questions and offered familiar conclusions. No immediate danger. No definitive cause. Follow up with her primary physician. By the time Charlotte carried Anna home, exhaustion settled over her like a weight she could not lift. Fear lingered beneath it, constant and sharp. Nothing had changed, and yet the room felt smaller than it had the night before, as though the walls were closing in a round problem that no one seemed able or willing to solve. The house was quiet after Anna finally fell asleep, her breathing steady but shallow enough to keep Charlotte listening from the hallway. Charlotte sat at the small kitchen table with the lights dimmed, the events of the afternoon replaying in her mind. The ambulance siren, the familiar questions, the same careful non-answers. Each memory pressed against the thought she had been trying to avoid since William Whitaker left her living room. She told herself she was being unreasonable. The proposal was inappropriate, unsettling, and difficult to place into any moral category that felt comfortable. And yet, now that the shock had softened, the details returned with unnerving clarity. William had explained everything once she asked him to be direct. A 1-year marriage, legal and public, but limited by clear terms. His son, Michael Whitaker, had been in a wheelchair since a serious accident years earlier. He was physically stable, but emotionally withdrawn, resistant to treatment, and disengaged from life. William believed that marriage, real in name, respectful in practice, might give Michael a reason to try again. Charlotte would not be expected to perform or pretend affection. There would be no obligation beyond shared presence and dignity. After 1 year, the marriage would end quietly, regardless of the outcome. In exchange, William would ensure complete medical care for Anna, diagnostic specialists, treatment without limitation. It sounded unreal even in memory. Charlotte's first instinct had been anger, then offense. She was not for sale. She had built her life on endurance, not compromise, but sitting alone at the table, listening to her daughter breathe. Pride felt like a luxury she could no longer afford. She imagined another year of unanswered questions, another night of panic, another doctor explaining what they could not do. The thought tightened something in her chest. William had not pressured her. He had not threatened or bargained. He had asked for discretion and given her time. That, more than anything, complicated the decision. He was not offering rescue. He was offering access, something she had been denied repeatedly. Charlotte rested her forehead against her hands. The choice felt heavy and irreversible, even with its expiration date. She knew what it would cost her emotionally. She did not know what it might cost her later, but she knew what doing nothing would cost Anna. She picked up her phone and stared at William's name until the screen dimmed. When she finally dialed, her voice was steady enough to surprise her. She told him she agreed, not because she believed in the arrangement, and not because she trusted the outcome, but because she was a mother and survival came before comfort. They left Des Moines early in the morning. the city still quiet as William Whitaker's car pulled away from the curb. Charlotte packed only what was necessary: clothes for herself and Anna, medications, a small folder of medical records. William insisted there was no need to bring more. Anything else, he said, could be arranged later. The certainty in his voice unsettled her. It reminded her how far she was already stepping beyond the life she knew. As the neighborhoods thinned and the road opened into long stretches of land, Charlotte watched the landscape change. Her own world had been narrow and practical, shaped by bus routes and grocery prices. William's world unfolded in wide driveways and open space when they turned onto a private road and passed through iron gates. Charlotte felt a tightening in her chest she could not explain. The house was not merely large. It was deliberate. Stone glass and carefully kept grounds suggested permanence rather than excess. Charlotte helped Anna out of the car and stood still for a moment, unsure where to look. Anna did not hesitate. Her eyes widened, and she laughed softly, taking in the size of the place as if it were something pulled from a storybook. Charlotte followed her more slowly, conscious of every step, every sound she made on the polished floors. She was acutely aware of her clothes, her posture, the way her voice seemed too small in the open space. Michael Whitaker was waiting in the main sitting room. The wheelchair announced his presence before he spoke. He was neatly dressed, his posture straight, his expression reserved. When William introduced them, Michael offered a polite greeting and a brief smile that did not reach his eyes. He asked Anna how her trip had been, then fell quiet again. Charlotte studied him without meaning to. He was younger than she expected, his features sharp, his gaze distant. There was no hostility in him, but there was no warmth either. His attention drifted often, as if he were elsewhere, even while seated in front of them. Conversation moved carefully, touching only neutral ground. William spoke when necessary, guiding the interaction without forcing it. Anna, sensing no danger, asked questions freely. Michael answered her with patience, but little elaboration. The distance between Charlotte and Michael remained intact, unchallenged by the shared roof above them. Both were aware of the arrangement, of the time limit, of the unspoken terms that defined their presence in the same room. As evening settled in, Charlotte realized she had crossed into a world governed by rules she did not yet understand. She did not feel threatened, but she did feel exposed. This place was not hers, and neither was the man who would soon be called her husband. All she could do was observe, wait, and hold herself steady as the ground beneath her shifted. The days leading up to the wedding passed in a blur of quiet efficiency. Schedules appeared without explanation. Appointments were made and kept. Dresses arrived, altered to fit Charlotte with careful precision. Everything was formal, expensive, and handled by people who spoke softly and expected compliance. Charlotte moved through it all as if observing someone else's life. She answered questions when asked and nodded when necessary, but none of it felt real. The scale of the event unsettled her most. She had imagined something small, discreet, almost symbolic. Instead, the preparations carried a weight that made her uncomfortable. She did not belong to this world of planners and quiet luxury. Each detail reminded her that this marriage was not born of affection, but of intention. It was designed to look correct, respectable beyond question. The ceremony itself reflected that same restraint. Guests filled the space, but emotion did not. Words were spoken clearly, vows exchanged without hesitation. Michael sat beside her, composed and distant, his expression controlled. Charlotte stood straight, her hand steady, her thoughts carefully contained. There was no warmth to perform, no expectation of joy, only agreement. And yet, during the reception, something small shifted. Anna wandered closer to Michael's chair. Curious and unafraid, she touched the armrest lightly, as if testing whether he might disappear. Michael looked down at her, surprised, then softened. His hand moved without hesitation, resting gently over hers. He said nothing, but his attention remained on her longer than necessary. Charlotte noticed. The moment passed quickly, unnoticed by most, but it lingered with her. It did not change the nature of the marriage, but it altered her understanding of it. That night, the house was quiet again. The room prepared for them was spacious and impersonal, the bed positioned carefully at its center. Michael moved to one side without comment. Charlotte stayed on the other. There was no discussion, no negotiation. The distance between them was maintained without effort. Charlotte lay awake longer than she expected, listening to the steady sounds of the house settling around them. She waited for discomfort, for fear, for the sense that she had given something away that could not be recovered. Instead, what she felt was a cautious relief. This was not exploitation. It was not expectation or demand. It was two people sharing the same circumstance, bound by an agreement neither fully wanted but both had accepted. The fear was still there, quiet and unresolved, but it was joined by something else, a recognition of shared resignation, and a fragile dignity neither of them seemed willing to abandon. The sound woke Charlotte from a shallow sleep, a sharp, irregular breath that did not belong to the house. She was on her feet before her thoughts caught up, moving down the hall with a fear so familiar it felt rehearsed. Anna was sitting upright in bed, hands clenched at her chest, her breathing fractured and panicked, eyes wide with confusion. Charlotte called her name and reached for her, already counting, already searching for the rhythm that usually guided her through these moments. This time it did not come. Anna's breaths grew shorter, her body rigid, the panic sharper than Charlotte had ever seen. Michael was there almost instantly. The sound of the wheelchair was brief and purposeful. He did not ask what to do. He reached for his phone and called emergency services with calm precision, describing the symptoms clearly, answering questions without hesitation. His voice did not waver. William arrived seconds later, fully awake, already pulling on a jacket. He listened once, then made a call of his own. When he hung up, he told Charlotte help was on the way, more than usual this time. The difference became clear when the doctors arrived. The equipment they carried was unfamiliar, the questions more detailed. They worked efficiently, communicating with one another in clipped, focused language. Anna was stabilized slowly, carefully, and moved to the living area for observation. No one suggested waiting it out. Michael stayed beside her the entire time. He took her hand gently and did not let go, even when monitors were attached and oxygen placed. Anna's breathing eased, her eyes closing as exhaustion overtook fear. Michael remained still, as if movement might break something fragile. Charlotte stood back, watching. The panic that had filled her chest began to loosen, replaced by something quieter and more disorienting. Relief, perhaps, but also the sense that this moment was different from everyone before it. When the doctors stepped aside to review initial findings, Michael finally looked up at Charlotte. His expression was open in a way she had not seen before. I know why you're here, he said quietly. Charlotte stiffened, uncertain. He continued before she could respond. He told her he had known about the arrangement from the beginning. His father had not intended him to. But Michael had understood long before it was spoken aloud. The marriage, the time limit, the purpose behind it, none of it surprised him. I didn't mind, he said, his voice steady. Not because of the agreement, because it was honest. Charlotte felt the weight of the admission settle between them. She had expected resentment, perhaps bitterness. Instead, she heard acceptance. I don't want you to feel trapped, he added, and I don't want Anna to suffer for anything that isn't real. Charlotte nodded, unable to trust her voice yet. In that quiet exchange, something shifted. The arrangement did not dissolve, but it changed shape. It became less distant, less rigid. Trust did not arrive fully formed, but it began fragile and unmistakable in the space between them as Anna slept on. breathing steadily at last. The answers came more quickly than Charlotte expected, and not without consequence. After a series of scans and consultations, the doctors gathered in a small conference room just off the main ward. Charlotte sat rigid in her chair, hands folded tightly in her lap, while William stood beside her, composed but alert. Michael waited near the door, listening without interrupting. The lead physician spoke carefully, outlining what years of routine examinations had missed. Anna's episodes were not anxiety or an unexplained neurological mystery. They were the result of a cranial injury sustained at birth, a subtle fracture that had healed outwardly but left internal pressure against a nerve pathway. Over time, that pressure had triggered the breathing crises and panic-like seizures. Charlotte felt the words land heavily. A birth injury, something that had been there from the beginning, something she had never known to question. The doctor continued, explaining that the condition was operable. A focused surgical procedure could relieve the pressure and prevent future episodes. The risks were real but manageable. The prognosis, if successful, was overwhelmingly positive. Charlotte's breath caught. Relief and fear collided in her chest, followed by a sharp wave of guilt she could not stop. She thought of every night she had held Anna through an episode, every appointment that ended without answers. She wondered how much pain had been endured simply because the right tests had never been done. William placed a steady hand on her shoulder. When she turned toward him, her eyes were already filled. He did not hesitate. "This isn't something you failed to do," he said quietly. "And it's not something you need to worry about fixing alone. Anna is family now. Whatever this takes, it's covered." The words did not erase Charlotte's fear, but they anchored her. She nodded slowly, accepting support she had never expected to receive. The surgery was scheduled promptly. Charlotte remained at Anna's bedside until she was taken into the operating room, holding her hand until the last moment. Michael waited with her through every minute that followed, silent but present, sharing the weight of uncertainty without trying to soften it. When the surgeon finally emerged, the news was clear and immediate. The procedure had gone as planned. The pressure had been relieved. There were no complications. Recovery would take time, they explained, but the episode should not return. Charlotte closed her eyes, letting the tension drain from her body in a quiet, uncontrollable release. Relief came first, then grief for the years spent afraid, for the answers delayed, for the child who had endured more than necessary. Beneath it all, cautious hope took shape. For the first time, Anna's future felt open, no longer defined by uncertainty, but by possibility. Anna's recovery followed a steady, careful rhythm. Each morning brought small confirmations that the surgery had done what the doctors promised. Her breathing remained even. The panic that once arrived without warning did not return. Nurses charted progress, adjusted medications, and spoke about discharge timelines with a confidence Charlotte had never heard before. Charlotte stayed close, learning how to watch without bracing for disaster, how to sit beside her daughter without counting breaths. During those days, Michael changed as well. He began attending physical therapy sessions without being prompted, committing to schedules he had avoided for years. The work was demanding and often humiliating, requiring patience he did not believe he still possessed. Progress came slowly, muscles responding in increments too small to celebrate, but it came. Therapists noted increased strength, better balance, improved endurance. Michael listened, nodded, and returned the next day. Charlotte and Michael spoke more easily in that shared space between hospital rooms and therapy gyms. Their conversations were practical at first. Medication times, therapy schedules, discharge plans, but gradually widened. They discussed ordinary things, Anna's favorite books, the quiet routines of the house, the limits they both lived within. There was no need to perform intimacy. Familiarity arrived quietly without demand. Then the momentum stalled. After weeks of effort, Michael reached a point where improvement slowed to near stillness. A session ended poorly. Another followed without progress. The therapists explained plateaus were normal, expected even. Michael heard only the silence where results should have been. One evening, Charlotte returned to the house later than planned and found him in the sitting room. The lights dimmed. A glass rested on the table beside him. She recognized the smell immediately. He had not touched alcohol since before the accident. The sight tightened something in her chest. She did not raise her voice or step back. She took the glass from his hand and set it aside. "No," she said simply. "Not this." Michael looked up, startled more by her steadiness than her words. He spoke quickly, defensively, explaining that it was temporary, that Anna was better now, that there was no reason for her to stay tied to someone who could not move forward. The words tumbled out before he could stop them. Charlotte listened until he finished. Then she spoke, not as someone bound by an agreement, but as someone who had chosen to stand beside him. "You don't get to decide this alone," she said. "And you don't get to quit because progress is slow. I didn't ask for perfection. I asked for effort." The silence that followed was heavy but honest. Michael lowered his gaze, shame evident in his expression. After a moment, he nodded. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I lost focus." The next morning, he returned to therapy, not with optimism, but with resolve. Time, which had once moved painfully slowly, now seemed to accelerate without warning. The calendar edged closer to the date that had been set from the beginning, the quiet end of the agreement. 1 year, a boundary drawn in advance, meant to contain risk and expectation. As it approached, no one spoke of it directly, but its presence shaped every conversation. Michael's progress had become undeniable. With assistance, he could stand. The act required concentration and effort, and walking remained uncertain. But the therapist spoke carefully of possibility rather than limitation. Each step forward carried promise, and with it, pressure. Michael worked harder than ever, as if progress alone might hold something else in place. William watched all of this with a restraint that was beginning to fray. He asked practical questions about schedules, about plans, but his attention lingered on Charlotte in a way it had not before. He began to anticipate absence, measuring the house as if preparing for a quiet he could already hear. The deadline remained unspoken, but it lived in the pauses between words. The tension came to a head one evening at dinner. The table was set carefully, the meal prepared with attention that felt deliberate. Conversation moved cautiously at first, circling around ordinary topics. Michael spoke, less than usual. Charlotte noticed William's hands tighten slightly around his fork. Finally, William cleared his throat. He did not ask directly, but the question rested plainly in the room. Charlotte set her glass down. Her voice was steady when she spoke. "I'll be leaving," she said. The words landed hard. Michael's posture stiffened. William looked up sharply, the composure he valued slipping for the first time. No one interrupted her, but the space between them filled with uncertainty. Charlotte continued, allowing the silence to hold. "Not the way you think." She looked at Michael first, then at William. "The agreement is ending." That part was always clear, but leaving doesn't mean disappearing. The explanation unfolded slowly. She spoke of choice rather than obligation, of the difference between staying because she was required to and staying because she wanted to. The distinction mattered more than the outcome. William listened, his expression shifting between fear and restraint. Michael did not look away. When Charlotte finished, the room remained quiet, not with tension, but with exposure. Nothing was resolved that night. No promises were made, but the truth had been spoken aloud. And with it came the understanding that what was at stake now was no longer a contract, but something far more fragile and far more difficult to replace. Charlotte waited until the house was quiet again before she spoke. Dinner had ended without resolution, and the weight of unspoken questions lingered in the air. Michael was seated near the window, his posture steady, his hands resting calmly on the arms of his chair. William stood nearby, attentive but restrained, as if bracing for news he already sensed was coming. Charlotte did not begin with explanations. She placed a hand lightly against the back of a chair and spoke plainly. She was pregnant. The words settled slowly, changing the shape of the room. Michael looked up first, surprise giving way to something deeper, recognition then understanding. William's breath caught. For a long moment he said nothing at all. His composure, so carefully maintained for years, finally gave way. He covered his face briefly, then stepped forward. Overwhelmed by relief and gratitude, he did not attempt to hide. This was not an extension of the agreement. It was not a condition or a compromise. The marriage, once bound by terms and timelines, had shifted into something chosen. What remained between them was no longer defined by obligation, but by presence and intent. Life continued, quietly and deliberately. Anna returned to school, without the shadow that had once followed her. The episodes never came back. She moved through her days freely, unburdened by fear, fully integrated into a family that no longer treated her as fragile. Her laughter filled the house in a way it never had before. Michael resumed rehabilitation with renewed purpose. Progress was not linear, and certainty remained elusive, but his commitment no longer wavered. Each session carried meaning beyond outcome. Each effort mattered. Charlotte stood beside him without directing or rescuing, offering steadiness rather than solutions. What they built together was not dramatic. There was no triumph, no reversal meant to impress. The transformation came through responsibility accepted and sustained over time, through endurance rather than spectacle. Family, Charlotte realized, was not formed by agreements or circumstances imposed from the outside. It was formed through choices made when leaving would have been easier, through sacrifice carried without resentment, through dignity maintained when outcomes were uncertain. For those listening, this story does not offer revenge or sudden justice. It offers something quieter, strength that does not announce itself, healing that arrives unexpectedly, and the reminder that sometimes the most meaningful bonds are not inherited or promised, but chosen. If this story resonated with you, consider what family means in your own life, what you have chosen to carry, and what you have been willing to fight for. Share your thoughts below. Your perspective matters, and your voice may be part of someone else's healing, too.